Good afternoon, everyone. This is Michael O'Malley here with the off-season edition of the Hurricane Outlook and discussion for May 10th, 2022, recorded on 2:10 p.m. Eastern Time. We have a lot to talk about today, including the potential for things to get interesting in the tropics over the next 10 to 15 days, and a look at what to expect for the upcoming 2022 Atlantic hurricane season. Taking a wide look across the tropical Atlantic this afternoon, we have a couple of things to note today rather than the last few days. First of all, we have this large area of rotating showers and thunderstorms out across here, this big area of low pressure that is generally centered up in the mid latitudes, and this is centered right now over the Gulf Stream for the most part. We can see a large area of showers and convection stretching from offshore of Florida through the portions of North Carolina where there's been some significant flooding from high winds over the past day. And all the way up here, you can kind of just see where this Gulf Stream lies within, where all the convection is and the associated kind of fronts are. And this is something that will be interesting over the next several days. It's something to kind of watch as this kind of meanders around and drifts a little bit towards the southwest and eventually makes its way back west or northwest during the next several days or so. And we'll take a look at this here in more detail in a little bit. We also have had our first tropical wave come off of Africa several days ago, and this is now no longer really showing up very well in the satellite. The tropical waves would be somewhere right in about this region here, but again, dry Saharan air and just overall unfavorable conditions, as we would expect for early May, is present across this area with showers and thunderstorms down here across portions of the intertropical convergence zone at this point in time. So nothing coming from Africa and nothing that will develop at least in the next immediate couple of days here. So taking a wide look across the equatorial Pacific and tropical Atlantic, this is the sea surface temperature anomaly map updated as of yesterday, May 9th. We can still tell that we're still very in a prevalent La Nina pattern, and this is likely to persist over the next several weeks. If you look here at the Nino 3-4 index, which is this area in through here, we notice that the entire boxed in area is with water temperatures that are half a degree to a degree Celsius below the long-term average, in some cases about a degree and a half. And that is pretty substantial in the fact that this is solidly in what would be considered a weak to moderate La Nina, and this is kind of approaching that borderline territory where we're in a moderate La Nina. And this is kind of definitely important because, again, these water temperatures, we thought maybe we were going towards an El Nino, but we've just seen no signs of that. And in fact, I don't see any signs of that happening for a while. In fact, we're likely to persist with La Nina conditions throughout the remainder of the hurricane season and potentially even into next year at this point if things kind of hold up. We also notice the very cold waters here, or cold compared to average, mainly across Africa and all, or not across Africa, but of course across portions of California, the California Peninsula there, down to the Baja California coast there. And this is also coinciding with a negative PDO pattern, and this definitely would go to suggest that we would be firmly within the corridor where I don't think we're going to see that much activity in the Eastern Pacific at all this season. I think that the Eastern Pacific season is generally going to be quiet. I think there will be a few storms here and there, a few intense hurricanes for sure, as always, but I don't think we're going to be seeing a very busy Eastern Pacific season, which, by the way, starts in 5 days now, is when the Eastern Pacific basin officially begins. And across the Atlantic side, we continue to know that the Atlantic basin is warming up ever so surely. We've had some recent warming in the main development region over the last several weeks, although that has briefly stopped and halted. And we'll take a look at that here in a moment. We also have warmer waters up here in the subtropics. Now, one of the things to note here is that the subtropics have cooled off in the last several weeks because we've had a pretty negative North Atlantic oscillation, and that has allowed for the deep tropics to warm and the subtropics to cool a little bit. So that is definitely some good news. And the Gulf of Mexico, which we'll take a look at here in just a minute, is definitely quite a bit above the long-term average, and we'll show that here in a moment. Now, if we look here at a different version of the climatology here, this is from another sea surface temperature anomaly map, the OISST maps. And this basically shows just a different climatology and different ways of calculating the sea surface temperatures here. Well, we notice that the main development region is quite a bit above the long-term average. However, I do caution because compared to the global mean, we can definitely tell a huge difference. Most notably, it's not warm out here. It's not stifling warm as compared to the other version here where we're just factoring in a different background set here. This is using the global mean sea surface temperature anomaly map. So there's definitely not as much warm anomalies down here across the MDR. And there's still quite a bit of warmth out here in the subtropical Atlantic. And that definitely will play a large role in what will happen for the upcoming hurricane season, and especially during peak season for sure. So we'll be keeping a very close eye on this. Again, I mean, there's going to be differences from here on out. And a large part of that, actually, what's occurring right now is that we do have kind of this pattern where we're favoring some stronger trade winds across the deep tropics here. A lot of this negative suggests, a lot of these purples in here indicate a lot of accelerated flow. And this accelerated flow here is blowing off and basically causing these waters to mix. And it is bringing up a lot of the cooler waters from below the surface and basically forcing them up. So you get this upwelling effect. And it's almost like a hurricane going over warm waters. It will churn it up. And so we're kind of seeing that pattern occur right now. And this doesn't really change for a while. In fact, this only begins to change at the very end of the forecast period. Very prominent here that we get these deep winds here to suggest these accelerated flow and mixing down here of the waters through the next several weeks. And then eventually at the end of the forecast run here, by the end of May, it looks like we began to warm this up here, but this is just a forecast here. This isn't necessarily what's exactly going to happen. The GFS ensembles here are definitely a better view of this, and we'll go back to the 6C run, and you can kind of see somewhat of the same thing according to the GFS ensembles. Again, we have an accelerated flow for the next several days here across the deep tropics, and then eventually that will begin to lessen and subside, and we get more warming across the tropical Atlantic by the end of the forecast period. So that will be something to kind of watch over the next several days, and that will be just something that we'll have to kind of keep an eye on, and we'll definitely revisit this come June 1st for sure. Now, looking at something a little bit more exciting, though, this is the ECMWF EPS. This is the 200 millibar velocity potential anomaly. So we're looking way up in the atmosphere where the tops of airliners fly at about 30,000 to 39,000 feet, roughly within that zone. And what we're looking at here, just to kind of give you a brief index here, this is a Hovmoller diagram. So this basically, as you go down here, this increases with time, and this map down here corresponds roughly to an area within the world. And these dark reds here, these oranges and reds, this is sinking air, and the blue and cyan and green, this is rising air. So just to kind of give you a familiarization of what we're looking at here. So again, this tells us here at the top here, these oranges and reds that were dry and sinking air, and this is moist down here and rising air. Just to kind of give you some brief kind of analysis on that. Now, what could be happening though? So over the next several days, we noticed that we're going to be having several convectively coupled Kelvin waves over the next several weeks move across the Atlantic and the Eastern Pacific. Now, a convectively coupled Kelvin wave is nothing short of just a wave in the atmosphere of rising air or sinking air. And we get these suppressed and active phases of the Kelvin wave that come around every so often. They are interseasonal variabilities, and this plays a large role, or one of the roles, in a hurricane season and development formation across the Eastern Pacific and the Atlantic basins, okay? And the Western Pacific too. But basically what we're looking at here, again, we're starting off this period here. Again, we're in a suppressed phase of the Kelvin wave, but we will be going to an active phase over time. It looks like here by sometime around really beginning tomorrow and then moving into about the 16th or so, there is an active phase of the Kelvin wave with rising air that makes its way over into the Eastern Pacific here. This kind of area right through here, this is the Eastern Pacific, and there will be some rising air that will begin to enter the Eastern Pacific over the next several days or so. After that point, that crosses the Atlantic basin, so we might see a reinvigoration of showers and thunderstorms over here off the coast of Africa. Nothing to develop though. But however, with time, we start to get more waves that come in, and by June 1st, the beginning of the hurricane season for the Atlantic basin, we have a Kelvin wave that will be moving through. This active phase of the Kelvin wave will be moving through portions of the Eastern Pacific and Atlantic basins during this time, for a little while, in fact. And so we can see this area roughly in here correlates to the Eastern Pacific and Atlantic basins, and we may see something try to develop after that point in time. And the Gulf of Mexico waters here are quite warm. We notice that this is just looking at the NSUP models in a 30-year CLIMO from 1990 to 2019. So this is using an updated climatology model here. And some of these sea surface temperature anomalies, especially in the upper Gulf here, are about 2.5 to 3 degrees Celsius above the long-term average. And this is definitely a little bit interesting because, we start to get into early season activity that develops down here, in the Caribbean and then moves northward, or something that tries to develop down here from an old front system in the Gulf of Mexico has plenty of warm waters to work with. And again, warm waters are not everything. There's other factors such as wind shear, moisture, etc. But this is just one of the factors that we kind of look for when determining formation probability. And this definitely goes to suggest that if something were to happen during this time down here, especially, once we enter early June, that there is a window of favorability both in the Eastern Pacific and the Atlantic basin side here. And then eventually this will cross over into Africa, and eventually by late June, according to the European, and again, this is getting out there, but by late June we enter where we have potentially an African or an Indian Ocean standing wave setting up over the Indian Ocean in Africa, and this would support tremendous amounts of upward moving air over the Indian Ocean and Africa, sending these tropical waves westward with time. So we should be seeing, certainly, that we might be seeing an increase in favorability over the next several weeks, and as we get into the early part of June. And then late June, I have my eye, but late June, early July, typically we don't really expect any development off the coast of Africa. It's just simply a little bit too early, but never say never. So with that being said, what else can we expect? Well, what else do we have? We talked about that one system that is sitting off the coast right now of the southeast U.S. And so to look at that here, this is the 150 millibar vorticity map. So this is the spin in the atmosphere at about 5,000 feet off the ground. And again, this is the United States here map. We have this big area of low pressure centered a couple hundred miles to the east-southeast here of Charleston, South Carolina, by about 500 nautical miles. And this is producing a large area of showers and thunderstorms that stretches for just a very long time. Now, there was some talk about this becoming potentially a weak tropical system over the next several days as it kind of meanders around the Gulf waters. We notice here on the GFS, here by hour 54, this is by about 2 p.m. on Thursday afternoon, this Thursday, May 12th, we continue to see here that the GFS does have a weak area of low pressure that is roughly about 130 miles centered offshore of Cape Canaveral, Florida. And at this point, this would be producing a very widespread shower and potentially thunderstorm conditions across a very large area. However, not really seeing any significant indications that this would be any tropical concern. If we take a look here at the 250 millibar wind, we noticed, however, that the storm, the center itself, would be positioned in at least somewhat of a favorable anticyclonic flow here. Basically, anticyclonic means that this is going in a clockwise direction here. So this is the big high pressure right here, and this might allow for some organization within the convective pattern. And given the warm waters down there, I wouldn't be necessarily surprised if we tried to get something to develop for a very brief time. We notice that where it's sitting right now, it's not really in the most favorable position. It is encountering some very deep vertical wind shear right now. There's a big ridge. This in itself is like a trough. And we notice that over the next several days, this begins to break down. And eventually, there is some pretty good pattern for upper level outflow for at least a while until this begins to kind of, the incursion begins on itself from an approaching trough here in the North Pacific, really, that's coming off the North Pacific. And then of course this upper level anticyclone will begin to fade over with time, and eventually that moves inland and dissipates. So the other important thing here is the 500 millibar temperatures, and this basically determines warm core or cold core. And we can tell here that, again, we have temperatures, generally speaking, of about minus 15 Celsius up at about 18,000 feet. And this, again, compared to some of the background environment over Florida, it's about negative 12, negative 11 Celsius. You could definitely tell that there's kind of a local maximum, two local maximums in here. And this tells me that this is probably a cold core setup. And if we just take the big box sounding over the entire region, we notice that there is some instability, but there also is a little bit of directional shear because, again, we can kind of tell here that we generally have southwest to northeast winds here, and then turning at about 200 millibars, we have winds that are coming from southeast to northwest. So we do have a little bit of vertical shear, although the wind shear is not particularly that strong. And we can take a look at that here on the GFS forecast. It's not particularly strong at this time at all. And if we go back here to the 850 millibar vorticity, we can kind of see that we just don't have that much shear across the area, but there will definitely be some. About 11 knots of shear up here, about from 200 to 850 millibars. So this extends through a pretty good depth column, and this definitely indicates to me that there may be just enough shear that will potentially limit development. The other thing, too, to kind of keep in mind here, again, taking a box sounding across this whole entire area, is that while we will have some pretty good moisture here, notice that it is pretty dry up here near 200 millibars. And while that's generally common, you would definitely like to see a little bit more in the way of moisture, a little bit more saturated, so we can get, so we don't have those downdraft potentials. And you can definitely tell, I mean, the D Cape here, only about 231, so not significant, but definitely something that would still like to see a little bit less of, because there's just an ever so slightly teeny bit of dry air. We can also see this in the precipitation field here. The relative humidity, we can tell that there's a big bout of dry air just getting sucked up into this thing, and that's probably one of the reasons why, too, this just never fully goes on to develop. Maybe tries to close off into a brief low here around hour 72 up near Georgia and South Carolina. Either way, a lot of rainfall coming to this area, but I'm not really expecting anything in the terms of a wind maker at all for sure. And in fact, the European ensembles, as of the latest 0Z runs, have absolutely no system here through hour 240, and that is all good news. Now, just to kind of go back and talk about this one thing here, we could be seeing the return of some anomalous westerly winds here across portions of the Eastern Pacific and Caribbean. This would definitely line up here in late May, sometime around when we have an active phase of the Kelvin wave coming through, and could help to maybe spark some the Central American Gyre or CAG event, in which we may have to watch the Eastern Pacific or the Caribbean for some tropical mischief there. In the severe weather realm, we have a risk for severe storms today across portions of Wisconsin, into extreme far northeastern Iowa and extreme southeastern Minnesota there, with a marginal risk surrounding that, and an enhanced risk from the Texas panhandle, or really the Texas kind of upper area into around southwestern Oklahoma. Tornado potential today, 5% centered in Wisconsin. Tomorrow we have a slight risk across portions generally of Iowa, South Dakota, including Minneapolis, and a slight risk also for portions of New Mexico and Texas. And day 3, an enhanced risk including portions of Minnesota, South Dakota, and Iowa, and a slight and marginal risk surrounding that. All right. With that being said, hope you all have a great rest of your afternoon and evening. Of course, I am Michael O'Malley, and I'll talk to you guys some more on May 15th when the Eastern Pacific hurricane season finally gets underway.